Alright, here are the solutions to the first quiz. The first question here asks you to express this set right here as a single interval. Maybe the best way to get a feeling of what this set is to graph it. You don't have to do this, but maybe it helps. So let's see, in this first interval here we want everything from -1 up to 2, but not including either of those points. And then in the second interval here, maybe I'll graph it right below, we want everything from 0 up to 5. See, we do want to include 0 because we have a closed bracket here. So I'll color this dot in. But we don't want to include 5. We want everything in between the two. So let's see, if we want the union of this set and this set, remember union means or, so we want the things that are either in this set or in this set. So that's everything from right here all the way over to here, right? Everything from -1 up to 5, but you don't want to include -1 or 5. So the answer here would be something like that. Moving on to the second part of part A. We have the same two sets, these same two guys we're talking about, but now we want the intersection. If you look up to this picture, we can figure that out. Intersection means and. So what this is saying is what numbers are in this set and in this set. And that looks like it's everything from 0 here up to 2. Right? If you're less than 0, you're not in this set. If you're greater than 2, you're not in this set. So to be in both, you have to be between 0 and 2, and we do want to include 0. So the way we write that is like this, from 0 to 2, include 0, don't include 2. So that's part A. Part B, sketch a graph of the values of x satisfying this thing right here. The absolute value of x is less than 3. Well, let's see here. Sketch a graph, so I'll start out with the number line. For the absolute value of x to be less than 3, another way of thinking about absolute value is it's the distance from 0. So we want all the points whose distance from 0 right here is less than 3. So 3 wouldn't work, right? Because 3 is a distance of 3 from 0, so it's not less than 3. So we don't want this point, but anything closer to 0 than 3 does count. And kind of the same idea over here. We don't want -3, but anything closer to 0 than -3 counts. So we fill in all this in between stuff, and we have our graph. Throw arrows if you want. And I think that's good enough. There's a graph of the values satisfying this. Good. Moving on to number 2. Number 2. One of these, just a big mess. Basically it says simplify. So what we got to do here is use all our different rules. I think the first thing I would do is get rid of this square root and this fourth root. And what I mean by get rid of is instead of thinking about this as the square root of y, we can think about it as y to the 1/2 power. Then on the bottom here, instead of thinking about this as the fourth root of 2 times x times y, we can think about it as 2 times x times y to the 1/4 power. And then all that mess is raised up to the 4th. Might seem like we've made things harder, but we can now deal with this 4. Right? The 4 kind of distributes down. It goes to all the things up on the top and all the things down on the bottom. So let's see, maybe we'll do up top first. 2 to the 1, 1 times 4 is 4. We got x to the -2, -2 times 4 is -8. Y to the 1/2, 1/2 times 4 is 2. And we've taken care of the top. Down on the bottom here, we have all this stuff raised up to the 1/4 power, then raised up to the 4th power. Right? When you have something raised up to a power, you multiply them. 1/4 times 4 is 1. So down on the bottom here, we just have 2xy. Now we can simplify even further. Let's see, we have 2 raised up to the 4th power on the top here, and just 2 to the 1st power on the bottom. So we can call that 2 to the 3rd power. 4 minus 1. We have y squared up top and just a y on the bottom. So what that nets out to be is just a y to the 1, 2 minus 1. Then this negative 8 is a little problematic. You might want to move this down to the bottom so that it's not negative anymore. So we still have this x right here, but now we also have an x to the 8th power, this negative 8. And now, simplifying one step further, you could leave this as 2 cubed. I'd be totally fine with it. But if you know that 2 cubed is 8, maybe that's easier to look at. Times y, and on the bottom, x to the 1 times x to the 8. You add up the exponents, and you get x to the 9. So I think that's about as simple as you can get it. Let's see, other answers that are totally fine would be something like 8y times x to the negative 9. Pretty simplified. Let's see what else we said was fine, is if you leave 8 as 2 cubed, and then you can do whatever you want with these guys. Maybe we'll do it in that form. So any of these guys are totally fine as your answer. Maybe I'll circle the square, this one. But just so you know, any of these you should get full credit for. And that's it. That's the end of the quiz.